Parashas Ki Seitzei. We'll look at the first pasuk out of the parasha. Ki Seitzei la milchama al oivecha. When you will go to war against your enemies, or as it says in Chassidus, on your enemies. That you have to come from an attitude that you're already winning, you're already victorious even before you begin the war. So we're going to look at what Rashi says over here. We're going to compare Rashi's interpretation in this pasuk to a few other places where Rashi speaks about very similar things in last week's parasha. So if you have a look, Ki Seitzei la milchama. So what does Rashi say? Ki Seitzei la milchama. B'milchemes haroshus akosov medaber. He says that this pasuk must be talking about Milchemes HaReshus, which means a war that is an optional war. It's not required according to Torah. And for whatever reason it is, here we're not going to get into what exactly constitutes an optional war. There's different opinions about it. But an optional war is what the Torah is referring to. Because if we were talking about a battle to conquer Israel, then there would be no opportunity to take captives. Sharik var nemar, because the Torah already told us in last week's parasha, lo yisechaye kol neshama, that you may not allow anybody to live. So the fact that there's the possibility of taking a captive means that it must be the kind of war where you are not required to kill everybody, which is not the war to conquer Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so if you have a look at this, the key word apparently, you would think that the key word over here should be the word ki. Ki Seitzei. Much earlier, already in Parashas Vayera, Rashi told us that there are 4 possible interpretations of the word ki. And the first of the 4 is if. Right? The first is if. Ki im. Right? The first one he says is im. The first possible translation of the word ki is if. That means that it's the one that is closest to the pshat. And so therefore, the word ki Seitzei la milchama should already tell us that we're talking about something that is optional, because it says if. And Rashi makes not even an oblique reference to this. He doesn't bring it into the conversation at all, even though it would seem to be the most logical thing. Before you get into any other evidence to the fact that this is an optional war, at least say something about the fact that ki typically means im, if. Okay, you're going to say that there are many places in Torah where ki is not used as the word if, but Rashi puts it as the first possible translation of the word ki. So you should at least say something about it. That's question number 1. Question number 2 is, why does he include the words ki seitzei in the dibur hamaschil, where apparently all he wants to define is la milchama, what kind of a war, because that's what Rashi talks about. Milchemes HaReshus. He's trying to explain to us what kind of a war. It's not an obligatory war. It's not a war of conquest. It is a war that is optional. So surely then, the Dibur HaMaschil, the headline which is supposed to tell us what it is that Rashi wants to talk about, should have been only the word La Milchama. Okay, so those are our 2 key questions that we're going to see on this Rashi. Okay, why doesn't he speak about ki? At least mention it somewhere. And how come he doesn't make the Dibur HaMaschil just La Milchama and instead quotes the whole thing? So in order for us to understand what's going on over here, what we're going to do, Yitzchak, you have a question?
Sorry, just so much is very obvious that by saying there's Reshus, right? Automatically, that's why it's if.
Yes, so you're starting from the end. The fact that he says it's Reshus is why it says if. Rashi should have said ki. First translation is im, if, and that's how I know it's Reshus. But instead what Rashi does over here is he says the only way that I know it is Reshus is because of what's going to follow next, v'shavisa shivyoy, that you could take captives. He should have said it's 2 things. Number 1, the word ki means if, and it also is proven from the fact v'shavisa shivyoy. What you're saying is that from the Shavisa Shivyoy, we know that it is optional. Fine, but still tell me that that links to the word ki. Rashi says not one word about the meaning of ki. That's the question.
Thank you.
Okay, so to continue, let's have a look at last week's parasha, because in last week's parasha we have 3 references.
Sorry, I was going to say Milchama.
Yes. So last week's parasha has 3 references to the word ki in the context of war. And it will be very interesting for us to see how Rashi deals with each of those 3, because here he is telling us Milchemes HaRashus, and he's proving it not from the word ki, but dafka from the expression Shavisa Shivyoy, that you could take captives, so therefore we know it's not one of those obligatory wars where you have to wipe everybody out. So let's now compare it to how he tackles the other references to going to war, where we have the word ki. The first one is very obvious. Ki Seitzei la milchama, when you will go to war, or if you will go to war. V'ra'isa amrav mimcha. Okay, we're not quoting the whole passage, we're just picking out the key words that are relevant to our conversation. And you will see that there is an enemy that is far greater than you are. Loi sira mehem. Do not be afraid of them. The next pasuk is Ki sikrav el ir lihilachem aleha. Also in last week's parasha it says when you approach a city to fight against it. So there again, it's in the context of war and it's got the word ki. And there the pasuk says v'karasa le'el shalom, that you should extend an opportunity to make peace with them. And the third one, that Rashi will come to in a second. The third one is ki satzur el ir yomim rabim, if you besiege a city for many days. Okay, so we have 3 references, all in the context of war, each one of them with the word ki. Let's see how Rashi deals with each of them. Ki Seitzei la milchama. Rashi says nothing. Doesn't say a word about whether this is an obligatory war or whether it is a voluntary war. Not a word. When it comes to the pasuk ki sikrav el ir lilachem aleha, when you will approach a city to attack it, there Rashi says b'milchemes harashus. That is talking about a voluntary war, as he says over here in our context as well. And then he continues, Kamoshem Meforish Binyan, Kein Taseh lechol ha'arim harachoykos. So shall you do to all of the distant cities. So in other words, Rashi there is implying distant cities means outside of Israel, where you are not obligated to go and to attack them. So therefore, it obviously contextualizes over here that we're talking about a Milchemes Harashus. And when it comes to Kisatsur el Ir Yamim Rabim, then we find something really fascinating. Rashi makes no comment on the words Kisatsur, when you will besiege the city. Instead, he waits until the word Rabim, many days, and he explains what does it mean many days, Shloisha, 3 days or more. Mikan Omru and Tsarin, from here we learn that you may not besiege a city 3 days before Shabbos, because we don't want to create a situation where you're dafka in a siege state on Shabbos. And then he says, over Milchemes Rishus Akasuv Medaber. There he says that it's talking about a voluntary war. So we find 3 references in the previous parasha to going to war, where 3 of those references also begin with the word ki. And look at that. Not once out of the 3 does Rashi use the word ki as part of his explanation. Exactly like over here. Ki Seitzei. Even though it would seem to be a useful part, even if you don't want to say it's the key, it's the fundamental way in which we know that this is talking about a voluntary situation, it still plays a role, or it should play a role, because ki translates as im, if, which means voluntary. Yet what we find is that there are 4 references now. 1, the first pasuk of our parasha, 3 from the previous parasha, all of which there's the question of what kind of a war are we dealing with. And apparently the word ki should have been helpful for us to understand it. And not once does Rashi bring the word ki in his interpretation. So that's strange for us. We need to understand why. We also need to understand how come it is that in the pasuk in last week's parasha, ki Seitzei la milchama, Rashi doesn't even discuss what kind of a war we're talking about. Is it obligatory or voluntary? He doesn't say a word about it. Why not? In the pasuk, ki sikravel ir lihilachem aleha, when you will approach a city to battle, to fight against it, there Rashi straight away says, b'milchemes harashus. It has to be talking about a voluntary war. The fact that Rashi goes straight into that implies that it's quite obvious to him in the pasuk that it is a milchemes harashus. You and I will assume that what's obvious about it is the word ki, because we know that Rashi believes that the first translation of the word ki is if, which is voluntary. So ki sikrav, if you should approach a city to battle against it, because of the language if, that's why he says milchemes haroshus. So then that raises another question, or two questions for us. How come suddenly here does it appear that Rashi automatically sees the word ki as voluntary, yet he didn't see it in the preceding pasuk, and he doesn't see it in the subsequent pasukim? So what about this particular pasuk lends itself more to saying, oh, it's obvious that it's talking about a voluntary war? And then we have to understand, if it is so obvious, why does he have to then bring proof from the context that's still going to come? In other words, it's the reason we feel that it's obvious in this pasuk is because he doesn't bring any wording from this pasuk itself to indicate that it's talking about a voluntary war. But then why does he bring proof from a later pasuk that it is a voluntary? Either it's clear, in which case I don't need any proof, ki sikrav, this pasuk itself is a voluntary war, or it does require proof, in which case he shouldn't say b'milchemes haroshus as an obvious statement. He should say, as we're going to see later, b'milchemes haroshus. In the third pasuk from last week's parasha, we have an even more interesting question. Rashi tells us that it's a milchemes haroshus not when it talks about the war. The pasuk says, ki satzur el ir, when you besiege a city. That's the language that is related to war. No comment over there about what kind of a war it is, if it's voluntary or compulsory. Not a word. When it gets to a technical detail, yomim rabim, how many days, that's where Rashi starts to talk about what kind of a war it is. Now that's a strange thing. It shouldn't be talking about it in context of how many days it takes. Should be talking about it in context of what kind of a war it is. So we've got 4 different references to psukim about war, all of which are linked to the word ki. None of them seems to match up with the others, and we need to understand why. So what the Rebbe is going to do for us is the Rebbe is going to say it's all about context. If you put something into context, it actually makes perfect sense. So let's go through each one of them and look at it in context. Okay? Ki Seitzei la milchama. Our pasuk over here. Ki Seitzei la milchama. When you go out to war. Now, I've just translated as when you go out to war. Why? Because later in the pasuk it says V'shavisa shivyoi, and you will take captives. In other words, when I read this in pshat, simple, before I look at anything that Rashi has to say, so that when I read this, I think it's telling me a scenario that I will go to war. The if, the unknown, because the word ki, if it means if, means that there's something unknown, right? So maybe it's unknown whether we're going to go to war or not. In this case, what's unknown is, will we have captives or not? That's how I would read it in pshat. Ki Seitzei la milchama, when you go to war because you are obligated to war, you may land up having a captive because of various circumstances. That's how I would have read that pasuk. Therefore Rashi comes along and he says, I know that this phrase v'shavisa shivyoin might have misled you. It might have given you the impression that the key word links to the phrase v'shavisa shivyoi. In other words, you might have thought that the Torah is telling us you must go to this war. But there is the possibility of finding captives. So Rashi comes along and he says, no, I'm going to explain this differently. I'm going to explain this as ki seitzei. You will go out. That's why the dibur maschil that he uses is not just the word la milchama, it's ki seitzei. There's a very important emphasis over here on the word Seitzei. Why? What does Seitzei mean? Seitzei means you'll go out. Now, if you go out, that immediately implies that you are in your place, in your haven, in your established place. And now you are going out of that place to fight this war. if the war was a war to conquer Eretz Israel, if it was the war of conquest, in which case you have to kill everybody and you cannot take captives, then we would never have used the word Seitzei, because you can only go out once you've already been in. In other words, you can only leave your place once you have a place. But as long as the Jewish people were wandering in the desert, it would be an inappropriate language use to say, Seitzei, go out of the desert. No. The desert is not our place. It's not where we live. We're going lehikanes. We're going into the land. That's the words that are used throughout Tanakh. Knisa le'Eretz Yisrael, to enter Eretz Yisrael. It's the opposite of Seitzei. So therefore, Rashi Dafka points out to us over here that the key does not reflect on V'shavisa Shivyoi if you should happen to take a captive. Rather, the key is if you should happen to go to war, meaning you should go out of Israel to go to war. So therefore, Rashi sees in this V'shavisa Shivyoi, the fact that you will take a captive, could not have referred to a war to conquer Israel. Neither could Seitzei have referred to a war to conquer Israel. Therefore, it is clear in this pasuk, not necessarily just from the translation of the word ki, because the translation doesn't help me. Now that I know ki means if, well, it could mean if you take a captive. I need the full context. Number one, that if you're taking a captive, it cannot be the battle to conquer Israel. Number two, if it says Seitzei, it cannot mean that you're going into Israel. It must mean you're going out of Israel. So in this particular context, the translation of the word ki would not have given me understanding that it's an optional scenario. And I need the entire pasuk in order to build the case that I'm talking about an optional war. Let's compare this to the other three. Last week's parasha said, Ki Seitzei la milchama, when you will go to war, V'ra'isa amrav mimcha, and you will see that your enemy is very large. So now, this war could be talking about a milchemes choiva. It could be talking about an obligatory war. And by the way, there are other obligatory wars, not only the war to conquer Israel. For example, the war to wipe out Amalek, where it could be possible that you're in Israel and you have to go out to fight that war. It is possible. So the war you have to do. Why is there key? Why is there if? If you see that the enemy is bigger than yourselves. That's not a guarantee. We don't know that that's going to happen. So that's where the key goes. So Rashi doesn't tell us, is it an obligatory war or a voluntary war? Because there's nothing in this pasuk that gives me that kind of clarity. There's in the previous pasuk, I had the combination of Seitzei plus Shavisa Shivyoi, 2 points of evidence that indicate it's a war that is voluntary. Here I have no evidence that it's a war which is voluntary, and the word ki fits to the expression V'ra'isa. If you should see that you have a big enemy, then you need to know not to fear them. But it doesn't tell me should you go to war. It could mean you have to go to war. And when you go to war, it might be a small enemy, it might be a large enemy. So Rashi has no comment on this pasuk as to what kind of a war it is, because he can find no evidence in the pshat in this pasuk as to what kind of a war it should be. Compare that to ki satzur el ir yomim rabim. This is really obvious. Ki satzur el ir yomim rabim. When you go to besiege a city for many days, well, nobody says you have to besiege the city for many days. That's not a guarantee. That's not an obligation. This could well be a milchemes choiva. It could be an obligatory war. But the word ki will reflect on the tatsur, the particular strategy of war that you're going to happen to use, which is to besiege the city. But nobody tells you that you have to besiege the city. All you have to do is go to war. So you would think, at that point, when you read those words, ki satzur el ir, at that point you would think, okay, not only would you think, you would know that the word ki means if you besiege. Now I need to know what kind of a war are we dealing with over here. Why would you besiege a city? What kind of a war may you choose? May you think that there's a reason to besiege the city? So therefore Rashi comes along and he says, sorry, I don't know where the Rashi went, it was supposed to be there. Anyhow, so therefore Rashi comes along and he says, Yomim Rabim, many days. Why would you have many days? Many days to negotiate peace. So you're negotiating peace. In that case, you're obviously talking about a Milchemes HaReshus. It must be a voluntary war where there's an option for peace. Because in an obligatory war, peace is not an option. So where does Rashi learn the Milchemes HaReshus in this particular pasuk? Dafka from the word Rabim. From the fact that it's going to be many days of a siege, which helps us to understand, as Rashi says, many days of a siege in order to try and negotiate. So now we know that it's a Milchemes HaReshus. Now we come to the critical one over here. Ki sikrav el ir li lochem aleha. When you approach a city to fight against it, ve karasa eleha leshalom, and you will call out in peace. Well, now it's clear in the pasuk that you're offering peace. So if you're offering peace, it definitely has to be a Milchemes HaReshus. It's pretty clear from the pasuk itself that we're talking about a Milchemes HaReshus. Okay? So, surely, there's nothing more to read over here. As Rashi indicated right at the beginning, Ki sikrav el ir, and the option is to offer them peace. Says Rashi clearly, V'karas eleh l'shalom must be Milchemes HaReshus. But Rashi is concerned about something. And that's why Rashi doesn't end over there just by saying V'karasa eleha l'shalom, that because you call them to peace, that automatically means that it has to be a Milchemes HaReshus. Why not? Because we already see in Parashas Chukas, and Moshe Rabbeinu repeats it in Dvarim, that when the Jewish people were going to attack the nation of Emor, where Sichon was the king, Sichon and Og were the kings. So here it says very clearly, divrei shalom, even though that was a Milchemes Choiva. It was an obligatory war. So, when you read the words Kisikrav el irli lachem alev koras el shalom, when you read it at face value and you say that this is a war where you're able to offer them an olive branch, and you can make peace with them, automatically you think that that would be Milchemes HaReshus, a voluntary war. Rashi is not 100% satisfied with that. He says, I still need to prove it from the context. That's why he says, later on in a couple of psukim time, it will talk about, so shall you do to the distant cities. Why does Rashi have that doubt? Because he has evidence of the fact that you can potentially extend a peace offering even in a Milchemes Choiva, as shown in the story of Sichon. So therefore, Rashi has to tell us, Ki sikrav, once you come close to the city, and you offer it peace, that is a Milchemes HaReshus. In other words, what was the story with Sichon and Og? The Jews were not yet at their border. The Jews had not yet approached and they hadn't yet gone into a war footing. They hadn't yet staged to attack Sichon. So in spite of the fact that they had a Milchemes Choiva, they had a mitzvah, a requirement from Hashem to destroy these nations, as long as they hadn't yet gone onto a war footing, they were allowed to offer them peace. This pasuk, however, says, Ki sikrav, you've already gone into the war footing. You're already approaching the city, Lilachem Aleha. You are in an aggressive, offensive state. And still the Karaseh Le'ala Shalom, and still you could call out to these people in peace. That must indicate it's got to be talking about a voluntary war. Because if it was an obligatory war, as soon as you activate the war protocols, you are no longer allowed to make peace with them. That's the chap. By Sichon and Og, the offer to peace was before the launch of war. This pasuk is telling us that even at the launch of war, you can still offer them an option of peace. That can only refer to Milchemes HaReshus. Let's take that now back to our pasuk. What have we seen so far? what we've seen is that the word ki on its own does not necessarily give us a definition of what kind of a war it is, because as we've seen in a number of contexts, the word ki could refer to another part of the pasuk. Ki, if you'll see that there are a lot of people. Ki, if you choose to besiege them. Ki shavisa shivyoi, which Rashi rejected. That you shouldn't think in this pasuk, the word ki is referring to the captives. If you happen in an obligatory war to take captives, this is how you deal with them. Rather, Rashi wants to say, ki seitzei, that there's the emphasis, that's how you're supposed to read it. Ki seitzei la milchama, if you should choose to leave Israel to go on another war, which is a voluntary war, these are the rules. Except there's something very interesting about the way that Rashi says it. He starts off by speaking about Milchemes Harashus, a voluntary war, Milchemes Harashus HaKasav Medaber, that the pasuk over here is describing the nature of a voluntary war. The opposite of a voluntary war is Milchemes Choiva, an obligatory war. So you would have expected Rashi to read as follows. The Torah is talking about a voluntary war. Because in an obligatory war, it should not talk about taking captives. But it doesn't say that. He specifically says, B'milchemes Eretz Yisrael. Dafka, when it comes to a war of Israel, that's when you cannot take captives. Why does Rashi want to emphasize over here that it's the war to conquer Israel as opposed to the generic concept of an obligatory war compared to the generic concept of a voluntary war? That's what we've got to understand over here. So what's the answer to that? Loi sechaye kol neshama. The Torah tells us very clearly that we may not allow anybody to survive when we conquer Eretz Yisrael. Loi sechaye kol neshama. Now, in this very discussion, in the next Rashi, v'shavisa shivyoi, Rashi is going to tell us in the very next pasuk, v'shavisa shivyoi is going to talk about what happens if you now leave Israel to go and fight a war, which is Milchemes Harashus, a voluntary war. What happens if the nation you attack happens to have some Canaanites living there? Now, the Torah told us, Lo sechaye kol neshama, that you may not allow any Canaanite in Israel to survive. We have to completely eradicate all of the occupying nations in Canaan. So now what happens if you go outside of Israel to attack another nation somewhere else? And in the course of that battle, you find that there are Canaanites living there. Maybe Loi sechaye kol neshama applies, and you have to kill them even off the land of Israel. Therefore, Rashi says over here, and in his Rashi v'shavisa shivyoi, that it's b'milchemes harashus compared to milchemes Eretz Yisrael. That the requirement to destroy the Canaanite nations is a requirement that only applies on the territory of Israel. B'milchemes Eretz Yisrael. That's where it says, Lo sechaye kol neshama, that you may not allow any survivors. But if it's even a milchemes choiva, theoretically, even if it's an obligatory war, if there were such a thing as an obligatory war off the land of Israel, that's the destruction of Amalek, but obviously there's a direct instruction that that the mitzvah is not to conquer the land, but to conquer the nation. But b'milchemes harashus, for sure, if it is a voluntary war that takes you off the land of Israel, there is no longer the requirement to destroy and kill Canaanites living in those territories. That's why he clearly says over here that the mitzvah of Loi sechaye kol neshama is a unique mitzvah that only applies to Canaanites in the land of Canaan. So in other words, what Rashi's done for us over here is, even though he's explaining the pshat, he's actually told us a halacha. He's told us a halacha. What's the halacha? The halacha is that there are two factors over here. The one factor is that there's a mitzvah to conquer Israel, and there's another factor, the mitzvah Lo sechaye kol neshama, that you may not allow the Canaanites to survive the onslaught when you attack Israel. Now, why is this relevant? You know, in Parshas Mishpatim, the Torah told us that Hashem is going to remove our enemies in Israel, me'at agorshenu, bit by bit. Why bit by bit? So he says practically, pen tiyeh ha'aretz shemama, because there's a concern that if you wipe out everybody at once, we won't have enough time. It will take too long to resettle the land, and the land will therefore lie desolate. So Hashem came up with a plan that it would be a gradual emptying of Israel, of the Canaanite nations, so that we would never have a scenario where the land is completely desolate. So Lo Sechaya Kol Neshama is not, this is what Rashi is alluding to over here. There's Milchemes Eretz Israel, there is the war to destroy Israel, and there's a different concept to Chaya Lo Sechaya Kol Neshama, not to keep the Canaanites alive. And they work, so to speak, hand in hand, but you could start conquering Israel and still have people living there, and that's acceptable, which, by the way, is what we see happen in practice. In practice, we see that even though there is some criticism of Yehoshua over how long it took to conquer Eretz Yisrael, ultimately it was correct. It had to take time, because the Torah says there is a mitzvah to conquer, and there's another thing not to allow the Canaanites to live. And they don't have to happen necessarily simultaneously. So even though that's not the key thing that Rashi is talking about over here, Rashi's primary thing to tell us is that Milchemes HaReshus, you don't have to kill Canaanites you discover in other lands. But by the way, while he's about it, he teaches us an inyan in halacha, which is that even if it takes some time to get to the point of Lo Sechaya Kol Neshama, and you're spending time conquering Israel without destroying everybody, that's actually acceptable, because there are two separate mitzvahs. There's a mitzvah to conquer, and there's a mitzvah to wipe out the Canaanites. Part of the mitzvah to conquer is to ensure that the land does not lie desolate, because then you'll be exposed to wild animals or whatever else is described in Mishpatim, and therefore you can delay the mitzvah of Lo Sechaya Kol Neshama until it is safe to do so. Now, we always say that in Rashi there's what's called Yeina Shel Torah. In addition to the Pshat, and in this particular case, the fact that it teaches us an halacha, there's also Yeina Shel Torah. Rashi teaches us things that have a deeper meaning and a personal lesson for us as well. Milchama, war. So the Zohar very famously says, Shas Tzloisa, Shas Kirova, that the time of davening is a time of war. More generically, Milchama is the war of the Nefesh Elikis and the Nefesh Abahamis, or Asen Yetzer Hara. The war to try and avoid temptation, the war to overcome our negative traits, the war to become more aligned with what Hashem wants. Now, if that is a war, how could we suggest that it's Milchemes HaReshus, that it's a voluntary war? Surely it's a Milchemes Choiva. Surely every single person has an absolute requirement to fight against the Yetzer Hara. Surely this is not something that can be left to the individual to decide. So therefore Rashi tells us over here, B'milchemes HaReshus HaKosov Medaber. The principle, the concept of the spiritual war that we go through, we get to choose if our spiritual growth has to be the war route or possibly a peaceful route. What's the difference? So again, the Zohar says, Shas Tzloisa, Shas Krova, that the davening is a time of war. But Torah learning, on the other hand, what does it say about Torah? That its ways are peaceful, and its ways are pleasant, and its pathways are peaceful. In other words, you have a choice. Will your primary way of overcoming your Yetzer Hara be, like the Gemara says, Mashchelo veis hamedrash, schlep the Yetzer Hara off to the yeshiva and learn Torah, in which case you can overcome the Yetzer Hara in a peaceful way? Or ki Seitzei, b'Milchemes HaReshus, you could choose that your primary way that you're going to overcome your Yetzer Hara will be through the battle of davening. That's why it's Milchemes HaReshus. The fact that we have to overcome our Yetzer Hara is not voluntary, that's required. How we choose to primarily focus which of the two channels, Torah or davening, are we going to take to overcome our Yetzer Hara, that's where we have a choice. Ki Seitzei milchama, when you go to war, you could choose that the war will be a so-called hot war, where you'll fight your Yetzer Hara during the course of davening, but alternatively you can take an approach which is an approach of peace, and that's through primarily learning Torah. So it's Chodesh Elul, and Chodesh Elul, of course, is a time that we're told Ani ledoidi v'doidi li, which is a representation of davening. So even if all year long we do a lot of Torah learning, as we should, this is a time of the year where we're supposed to choose to also focus extra on our davening. And in Mitzvah Hashem we succeed and we overcome the Yetzer Hara, and we're able to win the final battle, which is the battle of Golus, to bring Mashiach now.